The following is a production of the University of Minnesota.
Welcome to the role and importance of intercultural learning in an internationalized curriculum. Your presenters are Shelley Fisher, UMTC, Paula Peterson, and Shelley Smith, UMD. This session will be audio tape and videotaped. And during the last 10 minutes, during the Q&A, if you would like to ask a question, please use the microphone. I think it's around here somewhere. That will be passed around. If you prefer not to be recorded, please indicate to me that you would like a note card to write a question and then give it back to me. And I will give it to the presenter and they will answer your question. Thanks for coming.
I'm the Shelley Smith. This is Shelley Fisher. We're distinguishing us as Tall Shelley and Short Shelley. And so just so you know that we're both here. And that leaves Paula.
I'm the not Shelley.
Sandwiched in the middle between us alphabetically as well. We're talking about the role and importance of intercultural learning.
You got to be closer.
Closer? And for all of us in different contexts, this is an important piece of what we do. We kind of got together as a panel because we represented different parts of what happens in internationalizing curriculum. And we're going to introduce ourselves. But basically, Shelley works in study abroad. Paula is a faculty member who has done a lot of culture work with her students. I have a background in intercultural communication, and I'm now doing faculty development. So I work with our faculty on developing internationalized and diversity-related curriculum. So between the three of us, we are hoping to have kind of a spectrum. That means that this is not going to be, you notice that we're not sitting up there? A panel discussion. This is going to be hopefully a little bit interactive, a little more of a dance, where we can kind of all chime in about what it is that we do around the things that we're going to be talking about. And you all should feel free to interrupt us if you like, and we'll have a couple of opportunities very specifically for you to participate, just so you know. So, introductions. What is it exactly we're talking about? What are the essentials of student learning in an internationalized course, and how exactly do you do it? How do the issues of domestic diversity, power, and social justice interface with international? This is something that is really meaningful and important, I think, for all of us. And we kind of stole a little graphic from Portland State University that has makes a nice picture of this. And what do we all have to share with one another? Hopefully, before you leave this room, you will have recognized some people in it that you would love to trade emails with. Okay? So, who are we and what do we have to bring?
I'm Shelley Fisher. I'm a program director in the Learning Abroad Center here on the Twin Cities campus. I did my PhD here in curriculum. I think I did this the other day. I don't even know my major. It's such a I just let that part go. Wasn't traumatic at all. Comparative and international development education here on the Twin Cities campus. And I wrote about, I was involved in Michael Page's Maximizing Study Abroad course. That was a one-credit course for students who were currently studying abroad. And it was a semester-long sort of intervention in terms of promoting or facilitating intercultural sensitivity development and learning. And for my dissertation, I wrote about a group of 10 students who were in Australia with the idea that the literature asks or promotes students having difficult times and challenging times in order to make progress on that developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, and what happens when they aren't really seeing differences in culture. So I approached it in that sense and really found that the students didn't speak so much about what we would call intercultural differences or cultural anything really, but they But they did make progress and talked a lot about, and were very proud of, their personal development in terms of self-reliance, you know, that what we would call tolerance for ambiguity, independence, which mesh with what the university's goals, personal development goals are for its students. So that was a nice, you know, coming together, and made me feel like we are getting somewhere with the students who even study in what we would call similar cultures. So, and in my position here in the Learning Abroad Center, I work with faculty who lead short-term programs abroad.
Okay, and my name's Paula Peterson. I forgot the camera guy wants me over here, but I'm a little worried about the boat tipping this way when you look out here. We just want to keep things balanced here. And I'm also curious, before I say too much more about myself, just a little bit of sense we wanted to get of not everybody going around the room and saying who they are, but kind of constituencies. So, like, do we have folks from study abroad? Okay. Do we have folks from international students coming in? Okay. Do we have other faculty? Okay. Do we have administrators? Who am I missing? Pardon? Advisors. Yeah. Okay. Academic advisors. Good. Anybody else missing? Do we have students? Oh, librarians. Okay. So other staff and students. Yeah. Perfect. Well, that's one of the things we feel like we're a bit of a model or metaphor for this conference as a team. We also, part of our original group, she couldn't join us, but Barbara Kepler, who works with international students. So really this panel being a microcosm of what this conference is purporting, which is this idea that it is about an integrated effort where we're working together towards the same goals, which we define as this idea of intercultural effectiveness. So I represent a faculty on the team, and I actually teach in psychology on the Duluth campus, and kind of fell into this whole field through my research on teaching and learning. So I'm interested in what kinds of teaching and learning interventions have what kind of impact on student outcomes. And I, for the first time, had the opportunity to teach abroad in our Study in England Island program, a year-long program. And so I looked at, well, gee, what kind of student outcomes am I interested in? And then I got into this whole area of intercultural effectiveness, worldview perspective, and absolutely decided that is the purpose in life. So it's become my focus in terms of my pedagogy and my research. So I've done research on intercultural effectiveness with year-long study abroad, with several different short-term study abroad programs, and I'm trying to take the same lessons about pedagogy and curriculum into the domestic classroom, because not all students get the opportunity to go abroad. So how can we have the same impact, whether they're there, whether we're here? And that's a little bit about what I'm going to bring to this presentation.
And I'm Shelley Smith. I was realizing as I'm listening to this, I got my master's degree at Portland State University in intercultural communication, and spent a lot of time working with international students in intercultural communication workshops. And so my master's thesis ended up being about learning styles of international students. And my one claim to fame in life, NASA actually bought my master's thesis. So it's sitting in their library. I don't know if anyone read it, but they bought it from me. I then got my PhD here, again in intercultural communication, but did my initial graduate student work in the Office of International Education when it was called that, before it became the Learning Abroad Center and International Student Services, and at that time had the pleasure of working literally with and under Joe Mestenhauser and Michael Page. Then I ended up doing my dissertation on US students returning from study abroad because I'd been teaching the reentry courses and how they renegotiate their identities. So I was thinking about this, it's like I've kind of run all of the different places that we are today. Ultimately, I have ended up working with faculty, doing training and development around issues of curriculum, and have been able to sort of integrate that with my intercultural obsession, I guess is the word I would use. Can't get rid of it. So that's me.
Okay. Enough about us. We want to hear a little bit about what you get a little bit of interaction going. I wonder if we should take this mic around and just get a little bit of brainstorming about, our focus about what we believe all of the different perspectives that we come from has in common is something we talk about with intercultural learning. So the role of intercultural learning in an internationalized curriculum. So little brainstorming about what that means to you. And I can run around and be who's Ellen, Oprah. Yeah. Chip.
I've always thought of the most important outcome as being the discovery by students that in spite of everything we've been socialized to believe all our lives, human nature and American culture are not synonyms.
Okay, so a widening of an ethnocentric perspective. Is that a fair paraphrase? Okay. Yeah.
Somebody knows how to, Shelley?
I would
PC
say that
person.
students have learning
I can't
opportunities
manage.
academically and experientially from diverse background students. For example, like from minorities group student or student from foreign countries. And these things are very critical to define intercultural learning.
Okay, so for you it's about getting groups of students together from different backgrounds and perspectives and learning as a learning community? Is that okay? We're going to try to get this up there. What else comes up for people? I know it's late in the day. Any other thoughts?
Okay, we're going to need a recap.
So American culture is not...
Yeah.
Well, Chip, what did you say? American culture is not... Or human nature is not American culture?
Does not
That's
equal
not-
American culture. Yep.
I'm sorry, what was the second point?
Um,
Getting groups together?
Multicultural student learning communities. So the question is about old intercultural learning, what that is, what that looks like, what's our collective understanding of that. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Revealing underlying assumptions. Okay? Yes.
A perspective from someone else's seeing an issue from someone else's perspective.
Okay.
The unexpected aspects of self-awareness.
Okay. Self-awareness and unexpected.
I mean, people don't expect that they're going to have self-awareness a lot when they think about intercultural learning, but when they try to learn other culture, actually the first thing is they learn about their culture, and then that's a huge part of the intercultural learning.
Yeah, okay, so that cultural self-awareness that happens when we bump up against difference, and sometimes we don't know it. Right, we can't get that American culture isn't the norm until we bump up against something that's different, and then we go, oh, maybe I'm operating out of a cultural context too. Others? Yeah.
realizing that you can learn about other people but then still not agree with them. And so getting past the idea that you know, once you understand someone, you will by default agree with them, but you kind of break through that.
Sure, okay. So that awareness that we don't have to agree to appreciate and even maybe value or understand different perspectives, taking yours a step further. Hard to do. I mean, that's a tough one. He's calling for help. Let us know what they say. Sorry. Yeah.
Maybe separating what is cultural and what is actually due to other factors.
Okay.
Like
Example?
differences or historical differences or situational differences. You know, like, for example, equalizing Muslims with suicide bombers, right? And actually realizing that it's a situational, historical circumstance that places them not a religious or a cultural, it's not cultural to actually be a suicide bomber, something like that.
Okay.
I'm using
Sure.
that extreme example.
Yeah, but that's a good, I found that with my students studying in Birmingham, England, who had come from a hometown of 2,000, and they were making assumptions about the culture in England that were really more about big city culture. And so I think that's maybe another example of helping them to differentiate what is cultural in terms of this place and what's different and what has to do with, I mean, I would argue rural and urban are also cultures, but helping them to kind of differentiate what's what. Okay. Any other pressing thoughts, Karen? Sorry.
I would say the ability, gaining the ability to see the world in more complex ways.
Yes, increased complexity. We could really quit now.
Okay.
I mean, no, I mean, they've got it all, right? Okay, the end. No, let's just move to the last slide. No, if I didn't mean to cut off. If other thoughts, I mean, obviously people have thought about this topic before. So we want to kind of then add this collective understanding to some of the definitions that we want to propose as we move forward. One of the things we've learned, and you probably have also, is this idea that there's different terms used for this stuff. Cultural competence, intercultural effectiveness, intercultural competence, internationalizing, internationalization. I mean, there's so many different terms that people might use interchangeably, or we might use the same language but mean something different about what that looks like. So modeling this idea of what it means to be intercultural, that we might have different perspectives on that, and that's okay. So what are we talking about, Shelley?
Intercultural competence and effectiveness. We have 3 definitions up here that we feel kind of hang together, I guess. Because when we're talking about intercultural competence effectiveness, I think for me, especially coming from a communication perspective, drawing on Edward Hall is really the best thing to do. And so we're thinking of culture not as a static thing, but as a process, an interaction of creating of meaning between people. And many people will say, I mean, if you go to, how many of you have had the experience of going on the internet and looking up definitions of culture? There's, yeah, it's like 5 million hits on Google. And trying to sort of sift through all that to get past thinking of it as something static, institutions, arts, clothes, music, whatever. Those things are part of what we do as a culture, but they're not really where it lives. Where it lives is inside of people. And the way it's passed on, the way it's shared, the way it actually exists is the way in which we share it between us. And ultimately then, when we're talking about effectiveness, we're talking about what happens when the cultures come into contact. When my culture and your culture, when my way of making meaning and your way of making meaning are not necessarily a perfect match. And so we're looking at how we actually negotiate that contact. So this moves into taking that idea of competence to taking the idea of actually learning.
Yes, and this is one of the most exciting things for me when I stumbled upon this literature, is coming from a field, psychology, where even our cross-cultural attempts are about, this group is like this, and this group is like this. You're right back there. Ooh. So cross-cultural, my discipline comes from a very individual and cultural comparisons type of a theory base. And that was what my early training in psychology was about. I remember taking cross-cultural psychology, and I learned all these boxes. Okay, when you're working with the Native American client, this is all the things you should know. When you're working with the African American client, this is all the things you should know. So then I got into the real world and realized that was not helpful to me at all. That I just had more boxes, but people were still in boxes. And so what I love about this concept of intercultural and that idea of the not static, but the interaction between us, is that it's more generalizable and transferable. So that if I can learn the competencies and skills of being interculturally effective, then I can travel in and out of different cultures and use those same skills and competencies. It's not that it's more process-focused than content-focused. Content is important and part of it, but learning boxes about specific groups is not what we're talking about from an intercultural standpoint.
And bringing it back to study abroad for a minute, I just read the latest Georgetown study, and that really solidifies or kind of takes away from what we have commonly held as the gold standard for intercultural learning and language learning, which is if you just plop them in for a year to the host institution, that's the best thing you can do. You know, take them away from their contact with their home university and their friends, and just get them involved in the host culture. And what the Georgetown study has found is that that's not actually the most effective way in their testing results to achieve the greatest language acquisition and the greatest culture learning. They found that the students, there's a balance between too much challenge and not enough challenge, and you know, if they're totally overwhelmed, there's a possibility of shutting down. Whereas if they're not challenged enough, you know, then they're not going to learn either. So it's content and it's process and it's finding that balance of challenge. And what they're finding is that students who have a mentor in the process and continuously can reflect and make meaning of what's going on, those are the students who really benefit the most, both in language and culture learning, which is interesting because that hasn't been the philosophy for a long time in study abroad.
Mm-hmm. So then going from competence to learning to intercultural education, and I think Milton Bennett, Michael Page, all have talked about this idea that what it really culminates in then is this idea of the intercultural education being really about curriculum design. It's this systematic effort to foster intercultural learning through curriculum design. It's not just plopping them there, and it's not even add-on. It's not week 14 in this course. We're going to talk about diverse perspectives. So it's really integrating, infusing both content and process around this idea of difference. And we've had fun talking, the three of us too, about some of what this means in terms of our all working together, that perhaps no longer should faculty alone get all of the say in terms of their study abroad. They might be the content experts, but depending on what our goals and objectives are for a particular study abroad program, perhaps they need to work with an interculturalist in terms of facilitating some of those other learning objectives, which, and the study abroad and international folks, that really more of an integrated team approach is probably the way of the future in terms of really meeting some of these, of what the research tells us needs to happen. Yeah. So you're saying, I just want to make sure for the record, right? Because you didn't pick up. So the comment about because of technology and you don't have to wait for letters anymore, that idea of being plopped down in an immersion doesn't happen. Right. So then the argument would be, if I'm hearing you right, it's we need to even, that makes our job more important about facilitating for students, because they could plop down abroad and spend all their time on the internet, which I noticed your research talked about how much time they spent on the internet and Facebook. So we can use that to our advantage, or it could work against some of our efforts.
And I think we have to recognize that this isn't just what our students do. They are really good at it. They're really good at putting up boundaries and keeping focused on a very particular group of people they interact with and not letting anybody else in. And technology, unless you happen to be, I was in South Africa last year, and one of the volunteer sites, I remember the director was talking about how a student had had this huge temper tantrum and was screaming at her for taking away her God-given right to email because there was no internet access in the middle of the veldt. And I thought that was kind of an interesting, apparently the student later apologized and somebody jokingly said, "Over email?" And she goes, "Yeah." I thought that was good. Okay, so how does this look when we're talking about an internationalized curriculum? And it looks like two things. It looks like content, and it looks like process. And both of these are necessary, but neither is sufficient. If you just throw in some really interesting cultural content, a different book, a different article, a different film in your course, and there's no process for helping students to actually view that, I think as somebody said, through the perspective of the people who actually wrote it or produced it, okay, then you're missing a huge opportunity with those students. So we've got this idea of what content looks like, right? First thing, obviously, is what your objectives are. What is it we actually want to do with this course? And what part of what we want to do is discipline specific? What part of what we want to do has to do with helping them to see that international, intercultural aspect of what they're learning? So you're looking at discipline specific, you're looking at topic specific, you're looking at culture specific, and then ultimately, as Paula said, you're looking at culture general. And anybody have anything to say about that in terms of what sorts of things you've used out there in here? Yes.
Okay. All right, Michael.
I knew we brought you.
Thank you, Shelley. I appreciate that, yeah. Well, we've been doing in Berlin this thing with like Christianity and Islam and Judaism. And I kind of just fell into it the first time because I had an opportunity to take some students to a mosque. And it's one of these typical mosques in Germany. They're hidden and not really visible to people from the street level. But that became very interesting because that was the contemporary situation of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. But then we could go back in time because they've been in Germany since about 600, Jews have been. Yeah, and coming into Europe up from the Mediterranean, we had force of Islam, and then it developed into something going to the Jewish Museum. We could see this in literature as well, and so that was the sequencing part. But the kids didn't understand any of this without actually leading them through writing in journals and talking with them about it. And most of them, not most of them, many of them said they didn't like aspects of it. For example, when we went to the mosque, they found that neighborhood in Berlin to be very dirty, and they thought it was dangerous. I don't know why they thought it was dangerous, but they didn't feel comfortable there. And so it became, they all, at the end, reflecting, when they're doing their projects in the summer, they then see the importance of those experiences, but they probably would have struggled without explicit kinds of interventions. And you get better at this after 10 years, you know what's going to come up, usually. But that I see as strategy and sequencing. Yeah, it's the culture, but the process was very important in bringing those cultural pieces to them.
Anybody else?
Get to some more opportunities for kind of sharing and comparing to later.
So as Paula said, and I feel like we're all kind of, one of the things I like about this group is that we're all kind of echoing each other. An internationalized curriculum has intercultural and international issues and perspectives integrated throughout the course and program. I mean, if we're really talking about internationalizing a campus, all of the research suggests that if you take issues of diversity or issues of culture and you stick them in the multicultural education course and they're never brought up again, students continue to think of that as a thing which is marginalized, which is special, which doesn't really pertain to them. And what we want them to begin to think is that this is an integrated and important part of their world. You cannot ignore these issues any longer, even in Duluth, Minnesota, which, although our campus is 88.2% white, we just found those statistics, we're turning out students who are going to be moving into a world where these things are hugely important issues. The other thing is that we're trying to some degree to help students sort of take one more step on that road to ethno-relativism. And is everybody, I'm suspecting you all know what I mean when I say that. Anybody who doesn't? It's just the opposite of ethnocentrism. Okay. Yeah, no, this actually comes out of Milton Bennett's work, but it's basically the opposite of ethnocentrism. It's that developmental place where you begin to see that there are, in fact, multiple perspectives in the world, and that there are multiple contextual rights, in a sense. This works here. And as you said, it doesn't necessarily mean that I want to go live there and do that thing, but that I do recognize and respect the fact that in this context, that's the way it works, and it works well. And people embrace that with enthusiasm. Does that make sense? So we're trying to help them move there. This is torturous, and I think when Milton Bennett first came out with this continuum, you know, I used to, the middle point, the tipping point between ethnocentric and ethno-relative is this stage called minimization, which is where you go, well, you know, people are all basically the same. We're all human. And the differences are really small and surface, because we all have needs. We all love our children. We all, you know, need companionship and family. And I love that stage because it's so sweet. As we get a little more sophisticated, you know, there's some times we go, oh no. Yeah. But it's a really good spot. And I used to just, you know, I would get, my teeth would grind when I get somebody into my intercultural communication class who, you know, what did you learn from this class? Wow, you know, we're really not all that different. And I'd be going, oh my God, where were you? And now, you know, I see that as just, wow, you've really progressed. That's awesome. This is a very comforting thing to think of this as a journey at which you never arrive. We can spend, and I do this a lot, but Janet Bennett once said, and I love this quote, studying intercultural communication gives you an endless opportunity to go anywhere in the world and make a complete jackass out of yourself. And that's kind of the opportunity that you do. You can never know all of it, which is why the culture general stuff is so important. This idea of process, I think, is the most difficult thing. As people working in higher education, whether you're doing programs, whether you're doing advising, whether you're a faculty member, doing research or teaching, content is the thing that comes easiest to us. And sharing content is the thing that comes easiest to us. Actually figuring out how to help students take that journey to shifting a perspective, to approaching a new piece of information with an open mind, to exploring and emotionally engaging something and not expecting them to check their bodies at the door. Because we don't either. We all come into the classroom with values. So that piece, I think, is one of the things that we have to be really, really aware of when we approach these issues and bring them to our students and bring them into the classroom, or bring them into our program orientations, or bring them into our counseling sessions with our students.
That's all right, go ahead.
Right. Okay, this is our cool little model that we didn't make. Portland State made this. But I love it, and I'm going to continue to share it. The idea here is that there is this huge interface between issues of domestic diversity and international and globalization issues. And that interface is around intercultural competence skills and around power and social justice. And I think for a long time, power, dominance, social justice issues were things that interculturalists particularly backed away from talking about. And one of the things that I learned over time, if you can show me a culture where that is not an issue in some part, I will move there like tomorrow. This is something that's one of the most human conditions we have. And one of the things that happens is that whether you're approaching, like students who go abroad and come back have a tendency to suddenly see their own culture much more clearly. They're much more aware of the diversity issues that they're encountering right here. They're much more aware of people's differences and not just aware but attracted by them. If things have been facilitated properly, they've been able to see something about cultural and class stratification. And when they come back here, those are things that they're suddenly aware of, because Americans like to think of themselves as a classless society, and we're not. So these things move back and forth. People who are keen on domestic diversity often find themselves gradually migrating into embracing international and global issues as well. And there's a natural attraction between those things.
I'm looking at the timekeeper.
And
yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
I would just, in my experience, there's been, I think on campus, at various campuses that I've worked on, there have been issues between the multicultural offices on campus and the international offices on campus, and who's getting the resources and who's getting all the attention. And I just feel like once you can convey that these intercultural skills are general and they're transferable, that's so important. And I get backing up a little bit, with the students I worked with for a number of semesters on the Maximizing Study Abroad program, their pre-departure assignment was, how do you identify yourself as a cultural person, and what are the descriptors that you would use? And so many of them struggled with that, and so many would say, you know, I don't really have a culture. Oh, I'm Norwegian, you know, or you know what, and just trying to get them to think about what their culture is and what influences they have had on their lives and how they might view the world through the lens of those influences, I think is important. And I think sometimes you need to start a little bit lower in terms of this discussion than you might realize, or that was my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is where you get to share with each other. And there's two ways to go about this.
Big.
Yes.
I found your diagram very useful, but on the right side where you've got domestic issues, it seems to me that that can also be a diagram for when you're in another country looking at it. Mm-hmm. That we sometimes think that the domestic issues are here, and then there are international global things that cut across boundaries. But in order to really, if you're in Kenya studying it, you want to be aware of issues like globalization, global economic power and so forth, but you also want to look at how that relates to inequity within the society there, class inequity, tribal inequity, or whatever. So I just find this extremely useful.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah.
I was wondering, since now you are teaching the course, if you'd like to share a couple of examples from your course, how you integrate those content and process with your students in your course context, and what has been most effective?
Okay, sure. Are you thinking study abroad, in the classroom, both?
Both, yeah.
There's two models that I really like a lot. One is the DIE model that maybe you're familiar with. I know it's in Maximizing Study Abroad. It tends to be in all the places that do this work. So it's to help students, a model for encountering something that's ambiguous to them. And DIE stands for describe, interpret, and evaluate. And so regardless of what we're talking about, whether it's I'm with a group of students somewhere else or in the classroom, if there's something that's ambiguous to them, they don't know what sense to make of it, the DIE model says that our natural tendency is to go to interpret and evaluate. So we're interpreting what we see. Oh, they were so rude. Or in England, they just don't know customer service. You know, they don't bring you the check. Like, come on, where's my check? And so we immediately go to this interpretation through our own cultural lens and then evaluate that as bad. And so I teach that model and then use it throughout the semester in all my classes, because in anything we talk about, you know, in psychology, we can kind of, well, let's back up and try to describe, be more out of objective. What is it that you're objectively seeing? And then what are some different possible interpretations of that? So using an international perspective, I might use the global village and assign each student, okay, you're representative of the global village, what do they say about that? You're representative, what do they say about that? And pretty soon we have this ability to interpret based on a number of cultural lenses. I mean, that's probably my favorite model. Other questions? We got a couple more minutes for questions. Your own sharing. We're aware there's a lot of information in the room we have right here.
Thank you so much. This is a great presentation. I have a very small, simple question. It seems like, according to my observation, there's some gap understanding about internationalization between academic affairs and student affairs. I'm not saying it's good or bad, But when it comes to internationalization among faculty members, because they are core to make curriculums, how could we promote internationalization among faculty members? Do you have any idea or good suggestions?
That's what Shelley does for a living. But I also, while she's grabbing the mic from you, I want to, Gail shared with me Sanderson's, is that the right, article last year. I love it. I encourage we all read it, because it is about what you're saying, the exploring your own self as faculty, as staff, as administrators. We can't expect to teach it if we don't do it ourselves.
Yeah.
So.
We had, how many of you went to Brenda Butterfield's presentation? A few of you, okay. Brenda and Paula both participated in the first cohort that we did in Duluth on internationalizing on-campus curriculum. That was a week-long, very intensive retreat for our faculty. And it was helping them to kind of begin to get a handle on some of these issues. And we did a lot of resource sharing. We did some simulations. We worked with some models. We worked with some theory. A lot of stuff that we've been doing comes out of transformational learning theory. And I found that it's just as effective with adults as it is with students. Faculty do respond to situations that surprise them. They respond to having to analyze a case study, which has no right answer, and the answers that do come out of it are really disturbing on occasion. One of the things I really like to use is an old article from Newsweek that I pulled back in the 80s. And it was the story of a Japanese woman who came here to the US when her husband was in business school with him. She didn't speak English. She was extremely isolated. She had 2 children. She found out her husband was having an affair. And she drowned her 2 children and tried to commit suicide. And there was a huge uproar about what to do with this woman. Accuse her of murder, send her home. Right? If I talked to my Japanese friends, students, associates, they would say, this is a very sad situation. We wouldn't encourage that, but it's understandable. This woman's husband, in fact, didn't blame her at all. And they ended up going back to Japan. But the kind of conversation you have around that in terms of trying to understand what the cultural values could possibly be so different from our own that would make that an understandable act. That's a really difficult discussion. It's very intellectual. It's also very emotional and requires a lot of perspective shifting. And perspective shifting you don't necessarily want to do. Mm-hmm. So we use things like that.
I want to add something too. I know we're running short of time, but to me then I have to go back to the power and privilege and the whole systemic thing. That I think we need to change the paradigm, if you will, of academia. Because even to make interdisciplinary efforts is about more ethno-relativism. And when we're in our separate discipline silos, we're teaching this to our students and then asking them to go into the world and solve problems that are complex and require. So to me, part of what we're talking about, part of what this conference is about it all comes together. It's interdisciplinary, it's infused, it's integrated, it's international students coming in, coordinating with international programs going out, it's international faculty, that we really need to get rid of this silo mentality and figure out that really what we're talking about here is changing what this whole educational system look like that's compartmentalized, where we're working together more.
Yeah, and that's one of the things also I would definitely say about the training that we do is that, and this is the advantage of being in instructional development in a sort of an office that serves the entire university, we have interdisciplinary groups. And the discussions that happen in an interdisciplinary faculty group are really awesome. They learn so much from each other that they would not learn necessarily from their colleagues. Mm-hmm. The other thing is we did the IDI, the inventory that's based on Milton Bennett's continuum with our faculty and did counseling around that and planning. And there's a very ethical issue here. It's an ethical issue when we talk about trying to get our students to be more ethno-relative. It's an ethical issue when we talk about trying to get faculty to be more ethno-relative. Who are we to say it's a good thing for you to be culturally sensitive, right? And from my perspective, and this was something I struggled with. My bottom line, if you are teaching somebody else's children, yeah, I don't want you stomping all over them. And that's my bottom line. That's where I get off saying, I want you to know where you're at. I want you to think about what you believe. And that's, whatever it is, that's okay. But students know if you're not being authentic. And any transformational learning literature you read, anything that when I talk to students of faculty, when I go into Paula's classroom to do, we do these things called small group evaluation for her teaching sometimes. She asks. She's not quite, right? But one of the things her students will always say, Paula talks to us, she doesn't talk at us. And that authenticity, that willingness to listen, to engage them, to care about where they interface with what's going on, that makes all the difference. If students truly believe that you care about their learning, they'll go a long way to meet you in the middle.
Thank you. And let's not stop the dialogue. We got to do this more than once a year.